Hi, good evening, everyone. You're very welcome on with us this evening for the fourth installment of our coaching webinars, which we've started this year. We're delighted to be joined this evening by Dr. Catherine Norton. Catherine's from University of Limerick, and she's a full-time lecturer there. She's also a researcher and lecturer in nutrition, and she's over 20 years experience in the industry professionally. So many of you may have met Catherine actually at our coaches conference last year, where we got to get a presentation face to face, but we've brought her back because of her great knowledge to bring some more insights for everyone online. Um, so the format for this evening is Catherine's going to present on nutrition and fueling performance for sport specifically, and then after that we'll get to Q question and answers. Now the chat will be active the whole presentation, but mic and video will be disabled for you guys participating just to keep things smooth and on track. So any questions that you may have this evening, I would encourage you to put them into the chat function, and I'll type a few bits and pieces in there to remind you that you can put your questions in there at any point, and then we'll return to them at the end. Okay, so without further ado, I'll pass over to Catherine and let her take over.
Great. Thanks very much, Craig. It's kind of unusual to be looking at a screen that's just you and I when you know that there are other people there. Usually you can gauge people's interest by their faces, or you can at least see what they're having for their dinner. So I hope at this time of the evening that you've either had your dinner or you're settling down to eat something while you're tuning in. I'm delighted to be here. As Craig said, I participated in the in-person event last year, and it was lovely to see the interest that there was in nutrition, specifically for health and for performance, but more in this context for badminton. So hopefully by the end of the time that we spent together this evening, you'll have learned something about the importance of nutrition for general health, for training, for competition, and also for across the spectrum of all the different types of athletes and people who are on the call. Craig had mentioned to me that we'll have coaches and parents as well as some athletes. So exactly as he said, I would be delighted to address any questions that you have. Hopefully we might get through some of them in the course of the slide deck, but if not, do pop them into the chat and I'll be sure to come and answer them at the end. There is no such thing as a stupid question. And there are, across the breadth of experience that I have, unfortunately, pushing 25 years experience now in the industry. And I've worked across the breadth and scope of the practice. You can see in the slide deck here, whether it's individual pursuits or team sports or recreational athletes, all the way through to professionalism. Everyone generally has the same types of questions. The confusion that arises around nutrition is generally because of misinformation. So sometimes people think they know the right answer. But anyway, don't be afraid to ask any questions, and whatever questions you have, it's likely that I've heard of them before and I'll be able to answer them. And if I can't, then I'll find out where to answer them and I'll come back to you. There's three things really that I'd like to be able to get across to those of you who have tuned in this evening and those who are listening at a later stage. The first thing is, what should we be eating? The thing about what we should be eating is that I believe most people already know this. We all have a fair idea as to what a healthy diet is, the patterns and the frequency with which we should eat. But oftentimes it's much more difficult to do this routinely. And sometimes the key to figuring out why you're not able to do what you should be doing all of the time is maybe the understanding as to why you should be doing it. So we'll focus a little bit on what you should be eating, but also understanding some of the science behind it. Because if you have an idea as to why that recommendation is in place, it might be easier to tie it all together. And that's the last part that I want to address, which is the how. Oftentimes when people are talking about the difference between nutrition and dietetics, nutrition is a science and dietetics is the application of that science. So in some ways it can be a little bit of a softer science or an art form. And the how of putting what you should be eating together is what I'm going to address at the end of the presentation. So I'll try and break it all down into, these are the recommendations, this is why those recommendations are in place, and then putting it all together in terms of, so what should my plate look like? What should my child have in their lunchbox? How frequently should I be eating, and how do I put it all together? So I hope that in some way explains to you the format for the presentation and what you can expect to learn by the time we finish up this evening. More often than not, when I'm asked to come in to do talks like this, particularly when it's a sport like badminton, where they mightn't be as heavily resourced as the Irish Rugby Football Union or the Gaelic Games, oftentimes when you're brought in as a nutritionist for these bespoke presentations, everyone is interested in the secret sauce. People want to know what is the thing that I can do that is going to fix all the other things that are wrong with my diet, or what can I do that's going to be a fix-all, panacea for anything else that I might be doing appropriately. But unfortunately, there isn't really a secret sauce or a magic ingredient. And the foundation for any good sports and performance nutrition plan is on healthy eating, the basics of healthy eating. And this is really the part where sometimes people tune out and go, oh, she's going to talk about the food pyramid. I won't talk about the food pyramid, but it is important to recognize that hierarchically, what you do on competition day is at the very top of the pyramid. And what comes underneath that is, what do you do when you're training? How do you prepare for training sessions? How do you recover from training sessions, regardless of what the session might be? But then the foundation for all of that is, what do you do all day, every day? Do you skip meals? Are you adequately hydrated? Do you eat a sufficient variety of foods to support your immune function, your growth and development? So those are the kind of things that we'll address. And I think, because all dietitians like cake, an easy analogy for a lot of people to get their head around might be to consider performance nutrition as a cake. That the science, like the really sexy stuff that people want to know about all of the time, are the sprinkles on the icing on the cake. So the kinds of things that give you the very small advantages that you get for high performance athletes when everything else is looked after are the sprinkles that you see on that lovely pink icing. That's a very small part of what we put into a holistic approach to performance nutrition. The icing on the cake moves a step back then to not at competition, but in training. If you consider that in any training session, what you're trying to do is have a physiological adaptation to whatever it is you're trying to improve. So an example might be, if you're trying to improve power and strength for serving, you'd be in the gym. What do you eat before and after in order to amplify or to detract from the training adaptations that you're trying to put in place? If you were training for endurance, that it was particularly long matches that you were trying to improve on, the training that you're doing there and the energy systems that you're using again are different. So the training, the nutrition strategies that you put in support for that training are different. So the icing is the training, the nutrition for training. And then the sponge itself is, what do you do all of those other times outside of when you train and when you compete? What do you have for your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner? If we're talking about junior athletes, what kind of things do you bring to have between your lunch and school and when you go to the court on your way home? If you're involved in multiple sports, how do we ensure that not just the sprinkles, but the icing and the cake all come together to really, you know, in a symphony of getting everything right, that we can achieve everything we're trying to from a sports nutrition perspective? And oftentimes the key can be to try and figure out what it is that we're trying to achieve. Nutrition shouldn't be underestimated in terms of the role that it has to play across a whole host of different metabolic systems and physiological systems, whether it's locomotion or cognition or eye-hand coordination. It has a role to play in a lot of it. But if, as a coach or as a parent or as an athlete, you can try and figure out for a particular individual, what are we trying to do? It can make it much easier to interact with professionals like S&C or nutrition to figure out, well, what do we need to do in order to get there? And when it comes to nutrition, some of the things that people cite an awful lot would be, I want to get ripped. I want to get stronger. I want to reduce fat mass. I want to increase my lean tissue mass. And oftentimes the emphasis is all around body composition and achieving a particular type of body composition, whether it might be for gymnastics where it's aesthetic, for weight category sports where it's a requirement of the sport, or for something like badminton or those power sports whereby a particular phenotype, an amount of lean mass, a reduced fat mass might be beneficial to performance. But body composition mightn't be the goal for everybody. For some people, because there's a wide spectrum of people who are involved in badminton across the island of Ireland, we mightn't be focusing on competition. We might be focusing on participation. It might be from a social perspective that you're trying to meet people. It might be that you want to secure your position on a squad as first choice rather than being a substitute or further down the pecking order. And as soon as we figure out what the goal is, it becomes very clear then what the nutrition strategies should be. And the final part that we need to put into that puzzle is, what, as an individual, are you prepared to do? Because there's very little that happens from a nutrition perspective that happens by accident. So Craig and I were chatting before we started off the webinar this evening about different dietary strategies. And if you were deciding you wanted to eat a certain way, there's a lot of planning that goes into it. You've got to make a list. You've got to find a shop that has the items that you're looking for. You've got to bring it home and find somewhere to store it. And then you've got to meal prep for all of those occasions that you want to follow a particular pattern. So what are you prepared to do is another part that we need to consider. The guiding principles that I have on the slide deck here are the guiding principles that I'm going to work through over the next 15, 20 minutes or so to try and impress upon you the importance of these five principles that we're going to focus on. The first one is around fueling and the importance of fueling appropriately and trying to identify the fueling needs of different individuals, of different phases in a cycle, a mesocycle or a macrocycle, of different days within a particular week. So we'll speak a bit about that. The second and the fourth point are kind of related. It speaks to the importance of having variety and including all different food groups in a healthy, balanced diet. We'll speak a little bit about refueling and fueling and recovery from training sessions. And then we'll finish up by looking a little bit more on fluids, which in my opinion are probably one of the most underestimated and ignored aspects of nutrition, particularly for performance. So if we start off looking at fueling, there are two mantras that have become very popular in sport and exercise nutrition science and the scientific publications that sit around these. And these two mantras are fuel the work done, fuel the work to be done, or fuel to recover from the work that you've already completed. And if you think about that for a second, if we were going to fuel for the work to be done, so for this evening, if I were to have my dinner and say, right, what am I doing for the rest of the evening? I'll be sitting on a chair, speaking to a computer screen. I probably don't need to carb load for that. I don't have a high requirement for a high amount of energy available to turn over high amounts of energy in short spaces and duration of time. If after I finish this session, I was going to be going to the gym and do a strength and conditioning session, that work requires different preparation from a nutrition perspective. So knowing what we're trying to fuel for or what it is we're trying to achieve makes it much easier to do that appropriately and strategically and intentionally. The second point on the slide deck there is around energy balance and matching the work that you're doing with the amount of fuel you provide. Now, if I move on to the next slide here, you can see that there's weighing scales there at the top. Not a traditional step on it to see how much you weigh weighing scales, but rather a balance scales where you're looking at how much do you consume in a day and how much do you expend in a day. And I know as a practitioner that I've done an excellent job on educating athletes on what they should eat when I can see that they can self-select to eat differently dependent on the type of day that they have. And what I mean by that is for high performance athletes, they will have competition days. They will have days that they're training, and that training will change between skills development and skill acquisition, strength and conditioning, endurance, and cardiovascular exercise. And then there'll be days that they have a rest. And I know that I have an athlete who really understands what they're trying to achieve and the science and the nutrition behind it, when I can see that their daily meal plan is completely different from one day to the next, because they can acknowledge that the work is different. The balance of fuel that's required on a rest day versus a competition day are completely different. And even if you were to take 2 training days, dependent on the training that's done, they have different requirements as well. Now, we look at this a little bit later on when we speak more about intentionally fueling different training sessions. But for now, the take-home message is athletes should be able to identify, or coaches should be able to explain to athletes, that their kit bags should look different. The foods that they have in their kit bags should look different, dependent on whether it's skill acquisition, strength or endurance, or anything in between. That they should be fueling for the work that they're about to do, or fueling and refueling for the work that they've just completed. And imbalances in this mean that it's very difficult to achieve the physiological adaptations that you'd like to from the training that you've done. So what I mean by that is, if you're going to a gym to lift weights in order to increase your lean tissue mass, having an insufficient amount of protein dilutes down the effect that the training that you've just done, so that you don't get the same benefits from it. But the converse is also true, that if you go to a gym to do a strength and conditioning program and you have adequate amounts of protein and fluids and carbohydrates and electrolytes, but predominantly protein around that, you can actually amplify the effect of the strength and conditioning session that you've done and get more out of it than you would have had you not fueled strategically. Now, when we talk about those different days, a rest day versus a training day versus a competition day, each meal plan or each meal eating occasion within those days might look different, but broadly speaking, the representation that comes from different food groups should differ. So if you look at the pie charts that are here, the green one is representative of fruit and veg and salad. Now, if you consider the way that Irish people generally load up a plate when they go to a carvery, it's always pasta, rice, chips, mashed potato, Yorkshire pudding. So all those starchy carbohydrates, which are supposed to contribute a lesser amount, are the first things that we put on our plate. Then we follow it up with our choice of protein. Oftentimes, if it's at a carvery, it's going to have a batter or a breadcrumb or be deep fried or be swimming in a rich gravy. And then if the space left on the plate after our proteins and our starchy carbohydrates, there might be a little bit of turnip or carrot or frozen vegetables or something there. Now, this food plate model, and we'll come back to this at the very end because this kind of looks quite abstract when it's not in food terms. But when I explained at the outset, we'll do what you should eat, why is that, what's the science behind it, and then how do you put it all into practice. So we'll revisit this at the end with what I call a 1+1+1 model. So each eating occasion that anybody has, from juveniles to high performance athletes to recreational athletes, everyone needs to have fruit, veg, or salad, protein containing food, and starchy containing food. So that's breads, breakfast cereals, potatoes, rices, and pastas at each of your 3 main meals. And dependent then on whether this meal that you're consuming sits around a rest day or a day when you've got a moderate workout or a day that you've got a very intense workout, there's a swing in the amount of carbohydrate versus the amount of protein or fruit, veg, or salad that you consume. So when you're fueling the work done or fueling the work to be done, if there's more cardiovascular work to do, you could eat more starches. If it's more strength and conditioning work, you eat less starches and you eat more protein containing foods. Now, this is really designed for fully physically mature adult athletes. It has some resonance for adolescents, and for junior athletes, or for those who are 15 and 16 or younger, there's kind of a different model. But at a minimum, each eating occasion should contain a protein containing food, fruit, veg, or salads, and some kind of starches. But this can be very difficult, I appreciate, with junior athletes who don't like having certain fruits, don't like fish sometimes, or won't eat any vegetables. But we'll come back to it at the end, and I'll try and make it a bit more practical in terms of how do you do this. So that was the first point, the first guiding principle on fueling and fuel it up. The second one is mix it up. And this really comes down to the principles that your grandmother probably says of everything in moderation and not to exclude anything. I'm going to skip to my next slide because it explains it a little bit better. A very successful champion tennis player has recently made it very appealing to a lot of athletes to have free diets, or diets that are free from certain foods, whether it's gluten-free or lactose-free or sugar-free or even carbohydrate-free. There are some very high performance and very high profile athletes who've made it topical and appealing to have these restrictions in terms of what you should be eating. Without any diagnosed allergy or a diagnosed intolerance to a particular food group, there is no space in a healthy diet for restricted intakes. And I don't mean I don't like broccoli, so I don't eat that. I mean someone saying, well, I'm not going to eat any fruit and vegetables because some athletes said it was a good idea. It's never a good idea to take advice from Insta or bro science or influencers online. And the information that I'm presenting to you today is population-based dietary reference values that are research-informed and evidence-based practice. And there will always be somebody who says, oh, it works really well for Novak Djokovic or whoever else to have a particular style of diet. But just because it works for one person doesn't mean that there's a population-based recommendation around it. So after fueling up, my second recommendation is around mixing it up and making sure that there is nothing that you restrict completely in your diet. Now, completely accept that there will be people who follow halal, people who are vegan, people who have, for cultural, traditional, medical, whatever reasons, a preference or an indication to have restrictions. And in those instances, make sure that you get advice from a suitably qualified performance nutritionist to ensure that you've got everything that you require. But if you're just a normal, average, healthy Joe soap, there is no benefit in restricting gluten, lactose, carbohydrate in the absence of a diagnosed allergy or intolerance. So that's my second point. Mix it up. This third point, as I'd mentioned, kind of relates back to the first one. So fueling was what we mentioned already, and now we're looking at refueling. Refueling is to try and get you to imagine that for the breadth of athletes that you might be engaged with as a coach or even as a parent within your own families or as an athlete yourself, all athletes have different types of commitments and different types of requirements that they have and draws on their energy in their lives. A lot of high performance athletes are dual career athletes, so that they're full-time students. So that's a demand on their sports. Those who are not high performance athletes and maybe full-time students may be participating in multiple disciplines. So you're here today because you're all engaged with badminton, but how many of the athletes that you have under your care are also Gaelic footballers or rugby players or tennis players or anything else? And some of them may have not just one training session in a day, but multiple training sessions. They may play for the school, they may play for a club, they may play at a regional or a national level. And all of those things need to be considered when we're looking at refueling and recovering from the sessions that we've done. And then outside of adolescents and younger athletes, there may be people who have children that are dependent on them, or partners or carers or older parents that they have requirements to care for. And all of these have requirements from a fueling and a refueling perspective that increase the amounts of demands that there are. Children in particular have a much higher energy requirement than we generally appreciate because we think that they're smaller. And because they're smaller, that they require fewer amounts of food, fewer amounts of different nutrients, but they're also growing and developing. I mean, I think we could all acknowledge that women, when they're pregnant, have a higher requirement for nutrition because they're growing a whole new individual. But for young athletes, the requirements are not just for fueling the work that's done in training, but it's also fueling growth, development, cognition, and all of the other demands that are associated with that. When it comes to refueling from training that's been done, we need to try and identify what training did I do and what was I trying to achieve. So with the examples that I gave earlier on of I was in the gym, I was trying to increase my lean tissue mass, then that identifies very easily the focus should be on nutrition that supports the accrual of lean mass, and that would be protein primarily. If it was a case of I was doing cardiovascular exercise to improve my endurance capacity, in that instance, what we're trying to do is fuel a different energy system completely, and it's more carbohydrates that are required. And that ties back in with the plate model that I showed you a moment ago, where I was saying on days that you would have a high energy demand for cardiovascular exercise or for court-based activities, that there is a swing in the amount of starchy carbohydrates that are required. And then there are differences in whether you're training for performance or whether you're training for health. Some people might be involved in badminton because they're trying to improve their overall health, their metabolic health, rather than that they're trying to get to the Olympics in 4 years' time or even this summer. So this point of eat a rainbow or strive for 5 ties in a little bit with the no restrictions that I mentioned earlier on. So I've got the same image that's here, but it's trying to depict something different. With this strive for 5, I think a lot of you may be familiar with the idea of trying to consume 4 or more was previously the recommendation, portions of fruit or veg or salad on a daily basis. So that has now increased to strive for 5 rather than 4 or more. But those recommendations are for non-athletic cohorts. So for people who are just walking around doing what they do on a daily basis. And for those who are involved in high performance sport, this requirement can be between 8 and 12 portions of fruit and vegetables on a daily basis. Now, if we were all in the same room, I'd ask you to put up your hands if you felt that you were getting between 8 and 12 portions of fruit and veg on any given day. I'm pretty much guaranteed that nobody will put their hand up. But the rationale or the reasoning, the why behind this recommendation is because the more physically active you are, there's an assumption that you're going to be more healthy. But your respiration rate is increased, your cardiovascular rate is increased, the amount of people that you bump into when you're out running or in a gym or in a court are all increased. And this can, in some circumstances, place an additional strain on your immune function. And we know that the types of nutrients that support proper immune function are fruit, veg, and salad that are deep and dark in color. So the more of a variety of dark, deep colored fruit and veg and salads that we consume, the more likely it is that we're adequately supporting our immune system and our immune function. And that will just not prevent low-grade illnesses and coughs and colds and things like that, but also support long-term growth and development. Some of the other nutrients that are important in this context of eating a rainbow and trying to ensure adequacy across all the food groups, particularly for younger athletes, would be iron, and this is in particular for female athletes. Maybe not so much for badminton as it might be for other disciplines, but certainly for adolescent female athletes, oftentimes there's a reluctance to consume high amounts of red meat, that they may focus more so on fish or chicken, and maybe they don't get the amount of iron that they should from dietary sources. And then with the onset of menstruation, their blood and iron losses can be increased again. So trying to ensure, whether it's from red meat, which would be the best source of iron, or green leafy vegetables, or tinned fish, or fortified breakfast cereals, those are all very good sources of iron that should be included on a daily basis. B vitamins are very important. We often get those from grains and cereal containing foods. They allow us to release the energy from foods much more efficiently. So they have a role to play in metabolism. And again, because it's sometimes influencers can put people off carbohydrate containing foods, oftentimes we don't consume enough grains and cereals that have fortification with vitamin B. And the last one to bear in mind is calcium and vitamin D. Again, more recently, the fashion seems to be towards dairy-free milks and non-dairy alternatives, which don't have anywhere near the same amount of calcium and vitamin D as the original milk from a cow. So things like oats, soy, any of those dairy alternatives, it's extremely important, in particular for young athletes, that any of those options are fortified. So you can get an ordinary cow's milk, you can get an oat milk alternative or a soy milk alternative, but then if you're going for the alternative versions, they should say fortified, does contain fortification, in order to bring what's missing back up to the level that you would get if you were consuming standard dairy product. So this next point that I want to move on to, I mentioned at the outset, is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated aspects of performance nutrition. I've kind of given this away by the picture and the way that I've introduced this slide deck. But if I had my time back again, if we could rewind 10 seconds, I'd say, if I could give you a supplement that was free, that was widely available, that had no risks to health or performance, and that had no risk for any anti-doping violations, and that it could guarantee to improve both your health and your performance from a sports perspective, would you be interested in it? And there'd be very few people who would say no. I think you'd be a fool if you were to say no, because oftentimes with supplements, with those sprinkles that I spoke about at the outset, oftentimes they have risks associated with them in terms of, could you have an anti-doping violation? Could they be cross-contaminated with something that's on a banned substance list? So with something like fluids and being adequately hydrated, the benefits to health and performance are so compelling. And it's for this reason that they're, in lots of dressing rooms and in lots of education for athletes, we speak so much about the importance of consuming adequate fluids, monitoring your urinary output to see whether or not your status is good. So the why behind this, I've tried to explain on this slide. And in the image that you can see, along the bottom axis where it goes 0 down to 5.0, what this is representing along the bottom of that graph is dehydration. So when you're 0% dehydrated, you're not in any way dehydrated. So that means you're optimally hydrated. And that's, I don't know if you can see that arrow, that's this point here on the slide, under the 70 and just above. That's when you're adequately hydrated. And as you move over to the right-hand side, over to the 5, when you're 5% dehydrated, you'll know about it. You'll feel very thirsty. You're likely to feel fatigued at that stage. But if you move now to look up along the axis on the side where we have your performance. So when you are not at all dehydrated, you're performing to the best of your abilities. I'm not saying it's going to turn you into a superstar. Water isn't that good, but you're performing to the best of your own personal abilities. But if you look then down along that purple line, when you're as little as 1% dehydrated, your performance has dropped by a magnitude of 5%. And when you're 2% dehydrated, which is when the perception of thirst kicks in, that's when you start to feel, oh, I'm a little bit thirsty now, maybe I should drink something. Your performance, your own performance versus you on a good day when you're adequately hydrated, has dropped by as much as 10%. And this decrement to performance is because of increased cardiovascular strain, reduced blood flow, the difficulty that we have in thermoregulation and managing the heat that's produced during exercise, the strain that's put on our heart, the difficulty we have in delivering oxygen and nutrients to exercising muscles for the process of metabolism. Things like eye-hand coordination, decision-making, neurological function are all impacted by poor hydration status. So I've given you all the things that can go wrong, but all the things that can go right is you're able to dissipate heat easier. Your eye-hand coordination is improved. The levels of fatigue and the perception of effort that you put into something are all reduced when you're adequately hydrated. So if you were to take nothing else at all from the presentation that I've given this evening, I'd like it to be that athletes should pay more attention to the amount of fluids that they consume on a daily basis. And the easiest way to do this is by, and you can find these, I think every single sports drinks company can post them to you for free. You can download them from the internet, put them in your changing rooms for the places that your athletes train, stick them in your WhatsApp groups. Encourage athletes to assess habitually, nearly every day, the volume, the color, and the smell of their urine output. Now, there's always, if we were in a room, there'd be a giggle at this stage, and all the younger athletes would be going, she's mad, I'm never going to do something like that. But if you're looking at your urine on a daily basis, and you can see towards the end of a week when you've been training really hard, or you're on a warm weather training camp if you're a high performance athlete, if your urine output, the amount that you pee is less, and the color is darker, and the smell is stronger, that's the best indicator that you're dehydrated. And once you're dehydrated, it's more difficult to conduct any training session. It's more difficult to recover from any of them. And then if you've got back-to-back training sessions, it makes it, you're compounding the issue the further along you go. So the question that I'm always asked at this stage is, well, how much should you drink on a daily basis? There is no one size fits all. And the only way really for athletes to try and determine what their own individual fluid requirements are is to look at their urine output on a regular basis so that they can identify what their own requirements are. So with those guiding principles that we've spoken about, mix it up, fuel it up, strive for 5, refuel, and think fluids, putting them all together. I'm not suggesting that we'll turn an average athlete into an Olympian, but it would certainly mean that if you didn't have all of these guiding principles at their best, that it would not allow an Olympian to perform to the best of their abilities on any given day. Now, the next part that I'm going to move on to briefly is to try and show you how to put all of this into practice. Because as I mentioned at the outset, I think a lot of people already know what they should be doing, and now trying to move from these principles to putting it into practice and doing it frequently and regularly is the secret. And as I mentioned at the outset, what Craig and I were speaking about at the beginning, it doesn't happen by accident. It does require some planning. It needs to be a case of what training am I doing? What does my daily routine look like? What do I need to bring from a nutrition perspective to support the aims, the objectives that I have? So I'm going to try and make it easy by looking at the guiding principles that we have and then putting them into practice in terms of meal plans, encouraging around hydration assessments, and then looking at the outcomes for health and for performance. I thought it would be useful to mention, and MyFitnessPal is only one of many trackers that are available. I'm not a huge supporter of trackers, but for people who are new to nutrition or might be a bit insecure around their nutrition knowledge, it can be very helpful to download to your smartphone or your Android or whatever it is, a tracker that helps you to gauge, if this is what I need on a daily basis, what am I currently doing? And it can just improve your awareness and your knowledge around what the requirements are for energy balance, for refueling and recovery, and around those different macros on the plate model that I mentioned to you earlier on. So MyFitnessPal is one that you might consider using if there's elements of the presentation that you're saying, I really don't understand around macronutrients or carbohydrates or energy. They might just help to develop awareness and knowledge in that space. So I mentioned earlier on this whole concept of 1 + 1 + 1. And what I'm referring to here is that at each eating occasion in the day, you should have one item on your plate from carbohydrates. So breads, breakfast cereals, potatoes, rices, and pastas. You should have one representation on your plate from fruit, veg, or salad. And you should have a representation from a protein-containing food, whether it's animal-based or plant-based. So what does that look like? I think it's always very easy for people to say, well, at dinner time, I had a chicken fillet, I had 2 small potatoes, and I had some carrots. Box ticked. But your main meal in the day is probably the easiest one to try and determine have I ticked all those boxes for the 3 food groups that I'm trying to represent on my plate? Breakfast and lunch can be oftentimes much more difficult, with breakfast being the most challenging one, particularly if you've got young athletes and it's a busy household and you're trying to get out the door to school in the morning. So what I've tried to identify here are a protein containing food, a starchy carbohydrate, and then a fruit, veg, or a salad or a juice option that helps to put that 1 + 1 + 1 together, both at breakfast and at lunch. And then the dinner one, as I was mentioning to you, that kind of looks after itself. It shouldn't cost an arm and a leg. Oftentimes when I speak to teams of athletes, this is oftentimes with schools rugby, there's a perception that, oh, if we all have to eat more protein, it's going to break the bank and we'll have to be having fillet steaks every night of the week. That isn't the case at all. And because of the protein is really enjoying its time in the sun at the moment, not just from a performance and an athletic perspective, but also from a healthy aging and maintenance of muscle mass with older persons, that nearly all foods that are available as a standard have a protein added element. This is from granola to yogurts to breakfast cereals. Everything has and value added protein in there at no increased cost. So it shouldn't be as difficult as it was in the past to have some protein, some starches, and some fruit and veg at breakfast time. Similarly, at lunch, this can be a challenge for busy schools or kids with trying to get out to school in the morning. What kind of things can you bring? The default, I suppose, is generally a ham and cheese sandwich. Can we improve on that? If kids are bringing a ham and cheese sandwich to have at midday, but then they're also going to badminton or any other sport before they come home for their evening meal, what else could they have in the kit bag? If they knew that it was a hard endurance session, starches are what they need to bring. So it could be a cereal bar or a yop or something like that. If it was going to be a strength and conditioning session, then it definitely needs to contain some protein. And you can see that when I say protein, there are no shakes on the slide here. It's food first. It's chicken, it's fish, it's a tin of tuna, it's cottage cheese. So you can achieve everything that you need from a dietary perspective from food first, and you don't have to have a reliance on supplements. As I mentioned, main meals and dinners tend to be a little bit easier: meat, fish, chicken with potatoes or rice or pasta, and some portion of vegetables or salad or fruit included there as well. The last part of the how to do it and put it all together is around kit bag essentials. And I think as a parent and as a nutritionist, this is an area that we often fall down on, that we can focus on. What are we having for the 3 square meals? And then we'll all head off up to a sports hall in Cavan or wherever it is and hope for the best when there's a competition on. And then you realize that it's in a school in the middle of nowhere. There's no shop. There's only a petrol station down the road that has hot chicken rolls. We may as well have a packet of Jaffa cakes as well, just in case. Sometimes I see them on high performance athletes in Premiership football teams. But could we do better? What kind of things are we prepared to do to ensure that there are better options available in the kit bag? If it's yogurts, dried fruit, bagels and peanut butter, smoothies, any of those kinds of things, whether you need a thermos flask or a refrigerated bag or just throw them in your kit bag, these are options that should be easy to grab and go to make it easier to comply with the 1 + 1 + 1, or ensuring that you've got a strategy around the training that you're undertaking. So I'm hoping that this simple approach makes it easier to translate the science into practical dietary advice. Eat every 2 to 3 hours. Children in particular shouldn't have longer than 3 hours in between the occasions that they eat. So the pattern would be a breakfast, a snack, a lunch, a snack, an evening meal, and possibly something before you go to bed. Now, this mightn't always be the case for everybody, but certainly for high performance athletes and young adolescent athletes, this would be the preferred model from an evidence base. Complete and lean proteins at each eating occasion. So as I mentioned, dinner kind of looks after itself, lunch a little bit less so. Breakfast is definitely underrepresented when it comes to protein. So try and include lean proteins at each eating occasion, as well as vegetables. But carbohydrates, yes, include them, but be mindful of how much you need, particularly if there's a focus around body composition change or exercising for health as opposed to exercising for performance. So try and consider, what kind of exercise am I doing and how much from a starchy carbohydrate perspective do I require in there. Focus on whole foods, make it a food first approach, and cheat. There isn't any athlete who doesn't have a cheat meal or a cheat day. It's really important that it isn't this whole concept of a 24/7 athlete that becomes very intense. there's room at each eating occasion for a little of what you fancy. Or if you don't like to do it that way on one day in the week or one meal in the week, that you get to enjoy what you like. Otherwise, it makes it very difficult to comply with on a long-term basis. So when I mention food first, I'm not going to focus on food only. There are certain scenarios whereby it can be very difficult to achieve the requirements for food for sport through a food only approach. So there are some supplements that are worth considering when food is not able to tick all of those boxes. And these supplements are generally split into nutritional supplements or health-based supplements and ones that are specific to sport. So the nutritional supplements might be multivitamins. Sometimes they could even be iron supplements or vitamin D supplementation, those kinds of things. Sports supplements are generally protein shakes, sports drinks, maybe energy gels. And then ergogenics would be things like creatine, beta-alanines, particular types of caffeine maybe that you would intervene to try and get a performance enhancement effect. The important thing to recognize when it comes to supplements is that no supplements have been tested in children in under 18s. The evidence that we have that speaks to the efficacy and the safety of supplements is all in over 18 years of age. So in the absence of safety data for children under 18 years of age, the recommendation would be that we do not use sports supplements in that cohort. The second thing to say then is that even for athletes who are over 18 years of age, there are inherent risks in taking supplements. That if you're an athlete of a caliber who feels, I have my cake sorted, I have my icing sorted, I'm now looking at the sprinkles on the icing on the cake, then the advice would be that you take guidance from a suitably qualified individual who can speak to where do you source your supplements from? Have we ensured that they're compliant with informed sports choices? And that is a whole other presentation, but if it's something that is of interest, I can provide guidance on where you can get that kind of information from. So supplements potentially worth considering, but after food. Food comes first. Okay, there are hundreds of resources available online, some of which are not very reputable. So I've got two resources that are included here. One is from Safe Food, and that's endorsed by the Sport and Exercise Nutrition Register of the British Dietetic Association. And the other is from the National Dairy Council, and that's endorsed by the Irish Nutrition and Dietetic Institute and the Sport Ireland Institute. Both of these resources are freely available, so you can either download them as PDFs, or if you contact the organizations, they will send you hard copies of these books, and they're suitable for young athletes, but also older athletes. And they've got very useful resources in them in terms of what you should be eating, why you should be eating it, and how to put it into practice. The reason that I'm sharing those is, and trying to encourage you to get your resources from reputable sources, is that there are lots of less reputable pieces of information, particularly with the emergence of things like Insta or TikTok. And a colleague of mine, Professor Sharon Madigan, who's at the Irish Institute of Sport, has a saying, which is never take nutrition advice from a topless influencer. So there's so much misinformation around what you should be doing and how to achieve the perfect body composition. But ultimately, particularly for junior athletes, you need to ensure that you're getting advice from reputable sources. And some further guidances are available here. So both the Irish Nutrition and Dietetic Institute and the Irish Institute of Sport have good resources around nutrition, and they're quite practical. And there are some really nice education programs that are available, in particular for young school-going athletes through the Irish Rugby Union or through Gaelic Games that can offer good resources as well. So on that, I'm going to finish up and give you an opportunity to ask questions you have. The things that we've covered are what you should be eating, how to follow those guiding principles of fueling, refueling, eating a wide variety of foods and fluids and hydration, putting it all into practice in a way that's meaningful so that when you look on a plate, you can say, I have a protein, I have a fruit, veg and salad, I have my hydration looked after. So I'm hopeful that you'll feel better equipped now with a toolkit that allow you to make more informed food choices. And I'd be happy to answer any questions at all that you have.
Thanks, Catherine. That was very informative, and definitely I've picked up a lot there myself, even and I'm sure the guys on the call found it very useful. Guys, if you do have any questions at this point, if you want to type them in the chat, we'll cover off as many as we can. We have plenty of time still to cover a good few questions. Um, I suppose from my own perspective, Catherine, and the guys on the call, what kind of advice should we be giving, if any, to our younger athletes or our clubs, or even information for parents in the clubs in regarding nutrition, generally? Or where
So I
should we
think
direct them even for more information?
Um, I think it's important to acknowledge that in the same way when kids who are 4 and 5 go to primary school and all of a sudden my mammy has been replaced with my teacher, the voice of the coach is really, really powerful. And when the coach says, "Have you eaten your breakfast before you've come to the court? Have you brought a water bottle with you?" It really shouldn't be underestimated how impactful that is. And I can see that even with my own kids that I've like, and they know what I do for a living. If I'm saying you need to bring stuff with you, you need to ensure that you're adequately fueled. It doesn't really matter until, oh, the coach said I need to bring a water bottle. I'll get in trouble with the coach if I go in and I say that I haven't had my dinner. So I think as coaches, as parents who are involved in coaching, it's really important to acknowledge that your voice has weight, particularly with younger athletes. That's the first point. The second is if you're giving advice, make sure that it's accurate and kind of know what your limitations are. So it's, I mean, even for, I'm qualified years as a dietitian and also as a sport and exercise nutritionist, I don't deal readily with disordered eating, eating disorders, with, severe dietary restrictions. So as people who are interested in nutrition but not practicing nutritionists, know that your advice should be very general. And if you
Yeah.
feel you need help, I've tried to signpost it to where you can get um, good sources of information if you need to refer on.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Like I came off court actually before I came on the call this evening, and the player that was like he sweats a lot when he plays. I'm just reminding him small sips with of water between exercises or between drills, like rather than real nutritional advice. It's more very generic and kind of just stuff that, a parent would say, to
Yeah.
have you got a snack with you to have, or stuff like that. So I think that's very useful. So a few questions in the chat, Catherine. I'll read them out to you. So Francis is asking, how far in advance maybe of training or sessions should we be eating? I think that's
So
a very,
it
very
depends on
fair
what you're
question.
eating.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for team-based sports, like I'm involved with intercounty GAA at the moment. The practice for a match that would be 80 or 90 minutes in duration would be that you'd have a pre-match meal. Now a meal, not a snack, 3 hours beforehand. So the last large meal that you consume before you play a match, a badminton match, should be 3 hours. But in between the 3 hours, when you stop eating and when you're actually stepping on the court to perform, you can still be having banana, a yop, but it's more light meals that are easy to tolerate. It's very important as well that you don't try anything on days of competition that you haven't tried in training. So if you're going to say, well, fine, Catherine advised bananas and yop, maybe I'll try that after I've traveled to get to a competition. Make sure you try it in training first. So for Francis's question, if it's how long for a meal, 3 hours, how long can you eat anything that's smaller? That can be all the way up to stepping onto the court and in between um, games or in between sets on the court, even that you should be trying to top up the fuel that you have by having sports drinks, bananas, uh, even apple juice, anything that has carbohydrate or electrolytes in it, particularly for like the individual you mentioned, Craig, who
Mm.
might have electrolyte losses through sweat as well as fluid losses.
Yeah, because just someone sweating more like than somebody else needs
Mm-hmm.
maybe more refuel. Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Francis. Another one from Carol then, which is a good question, and it comes into maybe psychology as well a little bit here about a very sweet tooth. How do you help ease off it? Because children tend to, or people in general, maybe tend to eat emotionally a lot of the time, and for those sort of reasons, or after even they've lost a tournament, maybe they go and binge on something. Perhaps I wonder what your
Yeah.
thoughts are on that.
So there's a lot more to nutrition than just nutrients. We're not just fueling. I mean, the phrases that we have in our everyday language around comfort eating or a celebratory meal or all of those things speak to the psychology of food and how it ticks so many other boxes than just fueling either health or performance or growth or development. So we like when we're upset, we tend to comfort eat. When we're celebrating, we tend to comfort eat. There's a lot of research that looks at people in the early stages of new relationships and the average amount of weight that they gain. Because you're going out for dinner more, you're sitting down and watching movies with popcorn more.
Mm.
So there's so much more to nutrition than just I'm fueling, I'm recovering, and that needs to be acknowledged. If it's a case that that somebody has a sweet tooth, what you're trying to do is make sure that it's not a hunger. So you're trying to ensure that all of the foods that are necessary are ticking the boxes for I need to refuel. I'm hungry at this stage. So having foods in your kit bag if you're at training sessions or at courtside or in the car on the way to sessions or whatever it is. Now, if you're still at that stage that you go, well, I'm not hungry anymore, but I still feel miserable because I've lost. I want to have something sweet to eat. Then it's a case of portion size and portion control. So don't stop in the petrol station and buy a sharing bag. Buy one tube of fruit pastilles rather than the kilo bag or whatever it is. So it's having an awareness of, yes, there's more to food than just fueling. There is a comfort element to it or a celebratory element to it. But how can I control that in terms of, I'll make sure that I'm not absolutely starving when I'm going to indulge my sweet tooth, make sure that I'm looked after in terms of my recovery and protein and carbohydrates, and I still want something, portion control, make sure that it's fit for purpose for the individual, particularly for kids. Like all of these sharing bags, those, I won't even give brand names, that are now like they're 99 cents for a very large sharing bag, and kids are going, well, it's actually cheaper to buy that than it is a small tube. I'll go for the large sharing bag.
It's designed in that way, isn't it, for
Yeah,
those sorts of
yeah,
products?
of course.
Yeah. Thanks, Carol, for that question. Another one then, of the foods we saw, which ones are the icing, as you described earlier in the presentation?
So any of them could actually be the icing. So the cake is what you eat every day. The icing is the strategies that you put in place around a discrete training session. And then the sprinkles are what can we do differently on a competition day, or what are those small additional pieces that we can put in to get extra small marginal gains. So the icing itself would be, I've already had my breakfast, I've had my lunch, I've had my dinner, but in between my lunch and my dinner, I'm doing this discrete exercise session. What nutrition can either increase the physiological adaptation that arises from it, or in the absence of that nutrition, what am I missing out on? So you're deciding at that stage, it's a gym session. Protein is my strategy. That's what I'm going to eat. That's the icing around that training session. Or if it's an endurance cardiovascular session, it's carbohydrate. That's what I'm eating. So you still have your 3 breakfast, lunch, dinners, snack, snack, snack. And then your strategic snack around that one specific training session is, what session am I doing? What energy system am I likely to be using? What's the adaptation that I'm trying to influence and arise from it? And what nutrition is going to help with it? I hope that makes
Thanks.
sense.
Thanks, Arthur. Thanks for the question again, Francis. And another one then, just around electrolytes, and I know you mentioned that already. Is there any specific electrolyte replacement that is recommended for rehydration between games or matches?
So the easiest thing to do here, particularly if it's children, is make your own. So there are lots and lots of commercially available rehydration solutions. They're originally marketed and originally researched and brought to market as rehydration solutions for gastrointestinal upset. So if you've got vomiting or diarrhea and you need to replace electrolytes quickly, that's where those electrolyte replacement solutions originally came from. They were never intended really for use in sport. So what we're losing with sweat is, yes, fluid. We've also used up carbohydrates. So you're trying to replace the carbohydrates that you've used. And sweat is salty. So you've lost electrolytes in your salt. So what you're trying to replace with an ideal drink after or during exercise to prevent excessive losses of those 3 different groups, fluids, carbohydrates, and electrolytes, is a fluid that has a balance of all of them. Now, the commercial sports drinks that are available, they have a concentration. I'm going to get kind of sciencey here. They have a concentration of carbohydrates that's about 6 or 8%. And they have a small amount of electrolytes in them. If you were to take a 500 ml bottle of apple juice, pour out half of it, pour in water, and put in a pinch of salt, you generally have the same concentration of carbohydrates and the same electrolyte concentration as you would in an expensive commercially available sports drink. You can also achieve the same result by having 800 mLs of water, 200 mLs of a sugar, so not a no added sugar, a sugar containing Miwadi or Robinson's or any of those dilutes, and a pinch of salt. And they'd all give you the very same nutritional profile as what you'd get in any of the commercially available ones. And they're not dissimilar then to the oral rehydration solutions. but what they're missing is carbohydrate. So if you were looking specifically for a tablet that you drop in plain old water, then you've just got water and electrolytes in your rehydration. And for most people, they also require carbohydrates. The only time you wouldn't need carbohydrates in recovery is if your main focus was trying to exercise and at endurance in a cardiovascular manner in the absence of carbohydrate to try and drop body fat. So then you wouldn't be having carbohydrates in recovery. But for most people, those homemade options are nice and easy. And they're all actually available in the 2 sports booklet resources that I identified for you. But I can circulate if it's helpful, Craig. I can
Yeah,
send
I
on.
can
I
I
can
can
make your
pass
own.
that on with the slides if
Yeah.
that's useful for people. No problem. Um, I think I know the answer to the next question, but we're going to fire it out anyway. It's a combination of questions here. I suppose it's around should sugary drinks be encouraged, and specifically, what's the recommendation around energy drinks such as Monster, Red Bull, etc.
Okay, so I think those two questions that you just mentioned there, and then the previous one around rehydration solutions are probably all related. Um, when I started out in sport and exercise nutrition, I had a complaint from a dentist, and it was from a dentist on his own, and then a group of dentists who were saying that the biggest reason they saw for dental caries, which is rotting of teeth in younger children, it was seen years and years ago in kids who were given tea or sugary drinks in bottles. But there's a re-emergence of dental caries in children who are drinking sports drinks, because what children tend to do, and I'm not talking about 2 or 3-year-old toddlers now, this is all the way up to 15 or 16, they tend to pool the sugary drinks in their cheeks. They don't swallow all of it, and that then causes rot around the teeth and the gums. So one of the main things to ensure when it comes to the consumption of sugary drinks is that if you can get those squirty bottles so that the fluid that the kids are consuming is going straight down their mouth rather than sipping it and then it pooling around their teeth all of the time, that's helpful. The second point is that if they're involved in high performance sport and they do need these types of drinks, you can neutralize the acidity by nibbling on pieces of cheese, anything that has a basic element to it. So you're trying to cancel out the acidity of the sugary drinks by having a piece of cheese with it. It just neutralizes the acid in the mouth and reduces the risks of dental caries. So there's 2 things would be: eat cheese with it, don't drink them if you don't really need them. And the last part then is the drink with the spout, the ones that you push your chin onto and it just squirts the water straight down. So that's the first point. The second one then around Monster and the energy drinks and Red Bulls, nearly all of my colleagues who work in health promotion and clinical practice have been on This Morning or the Matt Cooper show or whatever, speaking about these exhaustively. They've become really, really popular, and they are more often than not high sugar, very high caffeine content, none of which would be recommended for children. They also come in a very large volume. They don't come in your standard 330 mLs. They come in a 500 ml. And they're marketed for kids, influencers and anyone who's on TikTok or Insta will see that it's cool to have these. Oftentimes kids actually take the bottle and fill them up with something entirely different. It's just the bottle that they want the effect of. So are they recommended? No, the caffeine content is too high. And if you were to look at the caffeine content of some of those high energy drinks, they would be the equivalent of 2 or 3 double espressos. And you'd never give that to a teenager, not to mind anyone who is younger than that. So dental health, caffeine and the withdrawal effects of caffeine if you overdo it, and the unnecessary sugars would mean that they would all be something that would be strongly discouraged rather than encouraged.
Yeah, I kind of gathered the answer for that one. I mean, they're definitely marketed towards a younger generation with all of even the names that they put on the bottles, and they're putting sports people on the actual bottles and everything. So, very I suppose dangerous in a way.
Hmm. And unnecessary, but unnecessary for health and unnecessary for sport, really.
Yeah. Question from Tracy. She trains first thing in the morning, strength or weights based stuff, and has a small bit of porridge beforehand. If traveling to the gym, and she trains on an empty stomach if training at home. Is that okay, or should she be doing something differently to that?
So if it's all strength-based stuff that you do early in the morning, what you're trying to do is strength-based training to try and increase hypertrophy or build lean mass. You can't build something without substrate, and substrate is protein. So if you're trying to increase lean tissue mass, the substrate for building muscle are the individual constituent Lego bricks for building muscle walls are protein containing foods. So if you're exercising in a fasted state, Will you get some benefit from strength training? Absolutely. But could you get greater benefit if you trained in a fed state that included protein? Yes, you could. So the recommendation there would be cardiovascular exercise to try and shift fat could be done in a fasted state with some benefits. But if you were trying to accrue muscle mass, then it really wouldn't be recommended to do that in a fasted state. You just don't get the same benefits from it at all.
Yeah, it's interesting that point. I actually a follow-on question from that from myself. I know myself, I put some protein into the porridge, like now supplements, but and then also how soon should you be taking the food or protein after you finish strength-based training? Because some people say within the first 30 to 60 minutes, and then anything after that is you're losing the regenerative capacity of it.
Not necessarily. So when I was training a good number of years ago, where there was a lot of talk around this anabolic window. So when you were strength training, how significantly could you improve the gains that you got from having protein within a very tight window of when you did your training? Now, for most high performance athletes, there isn't an anabolic window because they're always anabolic. You know, they don't just train one session in isolation and then do nothing for the rest of the day or the rest of the week. So if from it, but the textbook answer here would be within the hour. So 30 minutes before to 30 minutes after. At any like even 60 minutes before or after your training session, you're going to get benefit from the inclusion of protein. But if you're fasted starting off and if you leave it a long time to try and recover, longer than 60 minutes, then you're probably not benefiting to the same extent.
Yeah. And I
But as
suppose
you said, I mean, if that question from that individual was that I currently have protein, just like you said, I mean, if you were to put in 2 tablespoons of a high protein Greek yogurt, a couple
yeah.
of chia seeds on the top, you're done. So it doesn't have to be a supplement and it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be a lot
It
more
doesn't have
work.
to be like two chicken breasts. That's not what we're
Not at
talking
all. Not
about.
at all.
It's I suppose like 5 to 10 grams of protein is kind of what we're talking about. That sort of range, maybe.
Probably up at 20 actually.
20,
Yeah.
okay.
So
That's a good
the
gauge then.
20 would be the recommendation for each bolus of food that you consume, that it should be about 20 grams of protein.
Okay, that's good. Thanks. Another question from Elaine. How important is it for teenager to have wholemeal bread rather than white bread when eating sandwiches for tournament or a chicken sandwich for a tournament or something like that?
That's an interesting question. So the recommendation for health would be that you try and choose brown, wholemeal, whole grain, high fiber more often than you would do refined or white options. So this would be the same for breads, rices, pastas, breakfast cereal. So the higher the fiber content, the better in terms of weight management, cardiovascular health, gut function, all of those things. Now, the recommendation, and this is where the icing part of it comes in, the recommendation around the time that you train is that you want a quick release of energy, and energy is released quicker from foods that have a low fiber content. So, in the context, we'll say of Gaelic games, most people would be aware that the preferred traditional pre-match meal would have been pasta, white pasta with a chicken breast and pasta sauce. This would be because the white pasta releases its energy much quicker than a higher fiber content. So if the battle that that person is having with their child is you should be having brown bread on court days or on match days, the child is probably right. You should be having possibly white bread or something like the best of both of the half and half breads. And it's down to the glycemic index of the foods. Again, this kind of gets a little bit sciencey, but an easy way to describe it would be in terms of breakfast cereals. Breakfast cereals can often be categorized as either tricklers or gushers. And this relates to how quickly the sugar content of carbohydrate containing foods is released. So if you had ready Weetabix or porridge for your breakfast, you get a slow, sustained release of carbohydrate that's in them, which is great if you're trying to have a slow, sustained release of energy over the course of the day. But if you are going out to have a match on a court that's going to be a high intensity over a shorter duration, you actually do want a quick release of energy because you want that energy available for performance on the court rather than when you've finished and you're recovering later on. So the recommendation for carbohydrate containing foods every day would be high fiber, brown, wholemeal, whole grain. And then on the days that you need a quick release of energy to fuel a high intensity sport like badminton, you should actually switch to a white based option.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think people might not have actually known that. That's
Yeah,
quite
and
interesting
like it's,
because
I
we always
think
think
things like,
white bread is like no, can't have white bread.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Now I think the Premiership soccer teams have recently have kind of opened their doors on what they do in changing rooms at halftime, and what you see is white pastas, white breads, Jaffa cakes, jelly babies, and all of those things are available to try and ensure that players don't fatigue in the second
mm.
half. So they have
And
their pre-match meal, they sip on bananas or fruit juices or whatever it is. They go and they play the first half, and then they come off after that 40 minutes or so, energy depleted. And what they're having at half time is to top up those stores so that they can go again for the second half. So you
yeah,
don't want a slow, sustained release of energy. You want it now. That's where the recommendation for the whites comes in.
yeah, and I suppose like their like calorie output is so huge. Like it's they're burning so many calories as well, I guess. Um, um, and a lot of the I get we were talking about the energy drinks earlier. A lot of these sports teams are sponsored by X or Y energy drink,
Sure.
and and
Yeah,
the kids are seeing them drink them on the Premier League or the IRFU team or whatever it is, you know. So I guess that's where we have the influence as well.
sure. Yeah.
Okay, if there's no more questions, guys, I think we'll wrap up a little bit early. Catherine, if you want to send on those bits that you mentioned, I will pass on the slides to everyone, and I will pass on that additional information. Um, our next webinar is going to be in May, and the dates are going to be released for that soon. We are going to be joined, I'm not going to spoil it, but we're going to be joined by a former top 20 in the world player in badminton for that one. So I'm very excited. And we're going to be doing a Q&A session with them as well. But as always, Catherine, it's been brilliant to have you. And a lot of people mentioned, some left early there, mentioned it was great to get that reinforcement from what they'd heard at the conference. Just that refresh is quite nice to get on the topic,
Great.
and
Yeah.
hopefully it gives people a lot of food for thought uh, to bring back with them to their own setting or even their own personal uh, health. So
Absolutely. And if there are any follow-up questions that anybody has, if they send them on through Craig, I'd be more than happy to help.
yeah, I can maybe include Catherine's professional email on it as well if she's happy enough.
Sure. Yeah.
And anyone can fire on maybe if they have any follow-up stuff. And that concludes this evening. And I'm gonna let everyone go and say thanks again, Catherine, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Good
Bye-bye.
night, guys. Bye.